I'm pleased to announce our next speaker, Margarit Damyanov from the National Institute of Archaeology, who's going to present 5th century BC amphorae from a site in the CHORA of Apollonia Pontica. Margarit.
Yep. Do you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
We can.
Okay. Okay. Now I share the screen. And do you see everything?
Yeah, you just need to maximize.
No? I'm sorry, I probably have maximized on my screen.
Yes, it looks good now.
I'm sorry, I probably have some connection problems. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this Zoom meeting, PATABS, where I have to admit I feel a little bit out of my depth with so much. Nonetheless, I would like to present you the 5th century assemblage from a site near to Apollonia Pontica, and because such assemblages are so scarcely known and published from this region, I hope it will be useful. So this is the site at Mesarite locality, which is situated on the top of a hill, some 70 meters above sea level, at less than 3 kilometers from ancient Apollonia, on one of the main roads that led to the west and the north, to the coastal plain and the hills of Margarit and the copper mines there. So the site commands a dominating position, offering a good panoramic view of the city and its entire vicinity. It was the first site in the core of Apollonia to be investigated systematically by the joint Bulgarian-French investigations directed by Christina and Alexander Barelis, respectively. And I'm grateful to them for offering me the possibility to work with the materials. And the excavation started in the development of Mesarite 4 site, and that is the subject of this presentation, could be summarized as follows. It emerged at some point in the first half of the 5th century BC as a group of residential and farm buildings, and with some graves, at least from the late 5th century, also in the area. These structures existed to a certain point in the second half of the 4th century BC, and they were abandoned and replaced by an early Hellenistic necropolis that developed along the road, starting shortly after about 325 BC and covering the entire first quarter of the 3rd century and possibly a little bit beyond that. Partly due to its exposed hilltop location, the cultural layers are rather thin, and the archaeological materials are fragmentary and usually of poor state, as the soil is aggressive. And also the site has been partially disturbed by later human activities, mostly by the military in the second half of the 20th century BC. So these circumstances hardly make any easier the task to study the assemblage of the AMPHORAE, which is an ongoing process, not completed. I've been able to document a little bit more than, and study to some extent, a little bit more than 400 rims and toes, which are between 2/3 and 3/4 of the accumulated materials. Not the complete picture, but probably sufficient to provide a general idea. And also, and again, the scarcity of published AMPHORAE from Apollonia in its vicinity, even a preliminary report like this could be a step forward. And here I'm my aim is to illustrate the assemblage, and I'm concerned mainly with the chronology of the materials. No statistics will be offered, just general impressions. Well, the study of other datable finds, such as the black glaze pottery, 5th century BC, in fact, probably better than the 4th century, especially from the 2nd quarter on, but with a few fragments that hint at an earlier beginning in the 1st quarter of the 5th century BC. And the amphora seem to conform to this picture, starting with the easiest part. Due to their specific morphology, and bulging neck amphora are the most visible, and in fact appear to be quite prominent in the 5th century assemblage at Mesarite. The fragmentary state does not allow for very precise observations, but it appears that the developed and the late shapes are attested, dated to the 2nd and the 3rd quarters of the 5th century BC. I was unable to identify anything from the early bulging neck variant. So the Heian, some toes, and the Heian imports continue in the later 5th century, also with straight neck containers of Sergei Monachov's fan and Botros variants, down to amphora with the protoconical toes, the turn of the 4th century, and then followed by numerous conical toe amphora in the 300s BC that won't be shown here. And after this relatively clear-cut case, there are several groups that offer more complications, but are thought to originate from Ionia. So these are amphorae that could be attributed in general to the Samos Miletus types of the 5th century BC. Again, the fragmentary state impedes certain attribution to a specific type. For example, none of these rims have a sufficiently preserved neck to display this offset ridge that is one of the distinguishing features. There are also different fabrics that complicate the matters. Nonetheless, a few heavy and tall outturned rims resemble Mark Laval's S1 and S3 types, ranging from early 5th century to after 450 BC. And there is one rim here in the center that could be very early, from the 1st quarter of the 5th century. At least one rim, the one in the upper right corner, displays the very micaceous fabric that is typical of the archaic Milesian amphorae. There is also a cuffed toe from the 1st half or the middle of the 5th century, and ring toes from S2 type amphora from the mid-5th century or later. Then, well, the attribution of these amphora to specific centers is complicated. I would like to point out that some similar rims, flaring rims, were attributed by Monachov to Miletus in his earlier works, but then he reassigned them to Erythrae. So, and similar shapes has also been identified as Samian, but then again, not conclusively. Which brings us to the next group of fragments, which belong to this already discussed group of Zest Proto-Thasian amphorae, or amphorae on the complex profiled toes, attributed either to North Aegean or to North Ionian centers. Well, they are quite abundant in the Black Sea and in the North Pontic region, where they're usually dated to the later 6th and early decades of the 5th century BC. For example, at Berzan, they are quite well represented during period 2. Again, the fragmentary condition gets in the way of providing good parallels, but these are heavy, more or less angular rims on top of neck that is cylindrical or slightly narrows downwards. While an early date in the 5th century BC is certainly possible, like in the 1st quarter, I won't argue for a 6th century date because there is nothing at the site that would suggest it existed actually in the later 6th century. So while an early 5th century date is possible, similar rims appear to have continued in the second half of the century, as well as illustrated, for example, by the amphora from Tashburnu shipwreck. And in fact, the fabric of some of these rims resembles what had been described for the allegedly Eritrean amphora from that shipwreck. So there is this one toe that could be assigned to the complex profiled category, and probably one next to it. And they are probably of mid-5th century date, based on the few parallels I could be able to find. And the general absence of these very specific complex profiled toes at the site also indicate probably a later chronology in the classical and not in the late archaic period, and probably to the second half of the 5th century BC. And again, there is the problem of the attribution to North Aegean producers, Abder and others, as advocated by Sergei Monachov, and as suggested as possible or plausible by Chodar Tsochev this morning, or to North Ionian Center, as proposed by other scholars. One could add to the East Aegean imports quite a few of the heavy triangular outward projecting rims that are usually referred to as this Loha 1 shape. And some of them could be of 5th century date, as they're characterized by this higher underside of the rim. And one could be as early as 450 BC, with more of the turn of late 5th or the turn of the 4th century, down to rims that resemble the amphora from the eponymous Solocha Mount, dated to the 380s. And these amphora have been attributed to various centers, mainly in the southeastern Aegean. The number of fragments of lesbian amphoras appear quite modest, especially compared to the archaic period, when they are very abundant, both in Apollonia, based on what the situation on the island of St. Kirik, but also at other Pontic sites. As you can see, these are mainly fragments of handles with the specific round cross sections, but also a few rims and a couple of toes. Both lesbian gray and lesbian red are represented, lesbian red being more numerous, which is also comparable to the situation in the archaic period. Some of those rims may be early in the 5th century, but I won't be suggesting any more precise chronology. And then there are numerous fragments, toes and rims, that belong to amphora of northern Aegean origin, of Mendean and Thasian types, Pituit or other, but also probably from other centers in the region, as suggested by the variety of fabrics. While the majority of toes could be dated to the 2nd and 3rd quarter of the 5th century BC, there could be one or two here, first two, that could be very early, from Pituit amphora from the 1st quarter of the 5th century BC. Some more North Aegean toes and some rims and necks. And there are also a few rims and toes of the so-called high swollen neck amphora of the Thasian circle, recently attributed to Ainos, which also could be dated to the 5th century BC, some of them possibly before the middle of the century. And then the Thasian circle continues in the 4th century BC. We have the Iridio type amphora also at the site. And to finish the presentation of the types, here are two rim fragments in the toe of a Corinthian A prim amphora. These are special mention because they appear to be quite rare in the Black Sea. They belong to the later variant of the type, and could be dated around the middle of the 5th century BC. And to jump to the conclusions, the assemblage of amphora from the Mesarite site near Apollonia displays a picture that is typical of the Black Sea, a combination of East Greek and North Aegean producers. Chios is most recognizable and seems to be the best represented center in the period under consideration here, and continues afterwards. Types which are considerably less numerous. The attribution to North Ionian centers, Erythrae or others, of some at least of the Proto-Thasian amphora, would broaden the repertoire of the Ionian imports at the expense of the North Aegean, and where early examples of local one amphora could add to the picture of the East Greek imports in the later 5th century. The amphora of the Lesbian type, very numerous in the Archaic period, seems to be in decline in the 5th century BC. They're represented at Mesarite 4, but in limited numbers. And Northern Aegean amphora are on the rise in the 5th century, with some possibly early examples from even the beginning of the century, and more numerous in the second half. And the isolated Corinthian A amphora could be regarded as more or less exotic additions to the assemblage. In terms of chronology, there are numerous finds from the second quarter of the 5th century and beyond, even more numerous from the second half. And there are a few fragments that may be earlier from the first quarter of the 5th century BC. However, the apparent absence of early Chian Bojan neck amphora and also of the specific complex profile toes, Proto-Thasian amphora, indicate a somewhat later beginnings of the site. The picture corresponds with the impressions from the black glaze pottery with a couple of early fragments. So the site may have started late in the first quarter of the 5th century, but really got traction in the second quarter and beyond. Thank you for your attention. That was for me.